The International Monetary Fund and its sister organization, the World Bank, are both financial institutions which are based upon United Nations authority. It's not clear what the chain of command is. That's something that's always been a kind of a mystery as to do they take orders from anybody, and if so, who? But nevertheless, they're obviously closely associated with the United Nations. And it's a means of channeling money from the member nations who allocate tremendous amounts of money to the IMF. They vote for it, and it gets a little complicated because it doesn't always result in the money moving from, let's say, the United States to the International Monetary Fund. But what it does, certainly, sometimes it does, by the way, but usually it's a issue of assigning credits. The Congress votes, let's say, $100 million to the IMF, and the Federal Reserve then will come in and say, okay, we give you credit, we guarantee this amount of money. So it doesn't necessarily travel immediately to the IMF, but except as a credit. Well, then the IMF will issue loans or grants, and that's when the credit is used, and then the money eventually moves over to the IMF. But the real issue here is not the mechanism or the chain of authority or anything like that. The thing to keep your eye on is that this money is going to third world countries for the most part, or even larger countries that seem to have financial need. I mean, we've given a lot of money to China, we've given it to Russia, and so forth. But the focus usually is on some little country like Zimbabwe that, you know, people are starving. And the idea is that if we do this humanitarian thing and make the money available as a loan to these countries, that somehow this will upgrade the standard of living for those poor people there. And the average American says, well, that's wonderful. They applaud it and think how nice it is that our politicians are so humanitarian that they're voting to give my money to these countries. I approve of that. And but the fact of the matter is it doesn't work that way, like so many things in politics. There's the image and then there's the reality, and they're not usually the same at all. The image is one of a great humanitarian effort. The reality is that the money goes to the governments. That means it goes to the dictators in most cases, to the corrupt political elite at the top of those countries, and it goes right to them. And they use the money, first of all, to fatten their own pockets, to pay for their jets and the suites at the Waldorf Astoria and their palaces and their yachts and so forth. That's where it goes first. And the second line is to go to support all of their cronies, their political support mechanism, and then to support their military that they need in order to hold the population in line. And if there's anything that is left to trickle over, it might go to some of the people, but very little of that, and certainly won't go to any of the people in their countries who are considered to be dissidents, who do not support the regime. So the money doesn't go to help the people at all. All it does is to strengthen the dictatorial regime that has ruined the country in the first place. My opinion of the Obama administration is that it's doing exactly what I expected it to do. I'm not surprised. Of course, I'm disappointed because I see it as another example of this great difference between the image and the reality. When Mr. Obama was running for office, he and the media helped to create this image that he was going to bring about change. And there was certainly a lot of need for change. But when he was elected, of course, there was no substantial change except to make everything worse. Everything that Bush was doing that was terrible, Obama continued, only pumped it up a little bit. So that was the change. It turned out it wasn't a change of direction, it was a change of speed in the same direction. And so I'm not surprised. Earlier I mentioned this organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. You'll find that the candidates and the leaders of both Republican and Democrat Party are totally dominated by members of the Council on Foreign Relations. That is the group that determines the policies, foreign policy, domestic economic policies of the United States. And they are the ones who select the candidates. There is no candidate, in my view, that will be nominated for the Republican or the Democratic Party presidential frontrunner unless he has passed the test of the Council on Foreign Relations. All of the candidates, for as long as I can remember, for president, always appear before meetings of the Council on Foreign Relations, and they are grilled, and they're asked questions about what would you do in this case, what would you do in that case. They want to know what they think. And if they do not agree with the policies of the Council on Foreign Relations, they get a thumbs down. Mr. Obama was invited to speak before the Council on Foreign Relations, and they liked everything he said, and they knew that once he was elected, he would continue the same foreign policy, that he would continue the wars in the Middle East, that he would continue to support the financial institutions, that he would continue to take money from the taxpayers and give it to the banks and the insurance companies and support the crony system and keep the system going. They knew that, although the voter had no idea of that. The voter really thought that this guy, because he was sort of on the socialist side, seemed to be on the left and all of that, so surely he would change directions. But out of this now comes the great awakening, which is that in the reality of politics today, there is no difference between the Republican and the Democrat Party, no significant difference. And deeper than that, there's no significant difference between right wing and left wing. The right wing and the left wing are merely two wings on the same ugly bird called collectivism. If you analyze the political ideology of right-wing regimes like Nazism, fascism, and so forth, and compare that to the ideology of left-wing regimes like communism or socialism, you will be hard-pressed to find any difference between them. Different slogans, yes. Under communism, there's class warfare. You hate there's a conflict between the working class and the management class, supposedly. But under fascism, the hatred is racial in some cases, but there's hatred in both cases, that they use some kind of hatred to whip up emotional support for the voters who are expected to stop thinking when they have a dreaded enemy before them. And they all believe in the principles of collectivism, the primary one being that the group is more important than the individual, and that the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. That's one of the primary tenets of collectivism. They both adopt that in spades. And on down the line, all of the major elements of collectivism, as to the origin of rights, for example, the collectivists all agree that rights are issued by the state. Well, of course, if the state issues rights, then the state can take them away, right? And that's what happens under collectivism. Whereas individualists, who are the opposite of collectivists, would say, no, the state doesn't grant rights. The state is there for the purpose of protecting rights, but not to grant them. And there's some fundamental differences. You go down the line, and in every case, the right wing and the left wing are in total agreement. And that's the reason we can go from left to right in American politics, and nothing really changes except the rhetoric.